Sometime in early 2025, a woman in Texas crossed state lines to get abortion pills. This was because abortion was made illegal in her state. A detective from the Johnson County Sheriff's Office opened his laptop and typed a search into a database used by more than 6,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. He typed the words, "Had an abortion, search for female." What happened next is a window into a world most people don't know exists. Using an AI-augmented network of more than 83,000 cameras deployed across public roads in states where abortion is not only legal, but protected, including Washington and Illinois, the detective searched for her car, her license plate, her movements, across state lines, without a warrant, without her knowledge, without her consent. She was found safe in Dallas a couple of days later, and no charges were ever filed. Nothing she did was unlawful. But here's what I want you to sit with. A private company's AI-powered camera network, funded by Silicon Valley venture capital, and used by local police departments to solve crime, had just been used without a warrant to track down a woman for exercising a constitutionally protected right in a state that protected it. And under the current law, nobody, not the company, not the detective, had done anything illegal. I'm Danny, and you're listening to the Passing Through podcast. This is the Surveillance episode. This episode is about how the most powerful surveillance apparatus in human history was built, not by a government or a dictator, but in plain sight, incrementally, by companies whose products you use every day, funded by investors whose names you may not know, operating inside a legal framework that doesn't meaningfully safeguard your civil liberties. More importantly, this episode is about what it means for you, not in the abstract, but materially, in your wallet or for your body, as you pass through a world where your every move is being tracked, profiled, and sold.
Did you ever have the feeling you're being watched? That the eyes of strange, eerie things are upon you? Look, out there in the audience.
How do you build the most powerful surveillance apparatus in human history without anyone voting for it? Well, surveillance as a tool of power is not new. So let's step back to 1791, to Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. Jeremy Bentham was a social philosopher, and he's considered the granddaddy of modern utilitarianism. And he designed a blueprint for a prison called the Panopticon. So you can imagine a circular prison with all of the inmates in cells, with long, tall windows, and a giant camera placed in the middle, monitoring every person inside every cell. And his premise was simple. Just the threat of being monitored would force inmates to police themselves. They would internalize the discipline because they couldn't tell whether or not they were being watched. If we flash forward 184 years to 1975, we'll find French philosopher and sociologist Michel Foucault. And to Foucault, Bentham's idea of the Panopticon wasn't just a prison design. To him, it was a diagram of modern power. Foucault was interested in power and governmentality, and the idea that modern governance is fundamentally about managing populations through the accumulation of information about them. So you can imagine the census, public health statistics, crime mapping, economic indicators, all of these are technologies of population data, and political power in the modern state flows through the ability to know and categorize people. Flock Safety's 90,000 cameras at scale are effectively Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon deployed on public roads. But the U.S. had been surveilling people since at least the 70s. There was the FBI's covert surveillance program targeting domestic political organizations like the NAACP, the Black Panthers, the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, and journalists. They called this program COINTELPRO, and they even wiretapped Martin Luther King Jr. for years, sending him an anonymous letter encouraging him to kill himself. They infiltrated and disrupted organizations, not for crimes committed, but for opposing foreign policy or for exercising First Amendment rights to free speech in order to challenge the illegitimate authority of a state that didn't represent the interests of the common people. So in 1975, the Church Committee exposes all of this. There are congressional hearings, public outrage, people are shocked, and in response, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, also known as FISA, comes into play in 1978. It was the first legal framework attempting to build a barrier between state intelligence collection and American citizens' lives. And this attempt to curtail government overreach is important, so keep this in mind. We're going to come back to it later. While Congress was building FISA, something else worth mentioning was happening in the public sector. Because data collection isn't new. Credit bureaus had been quietly collecting data on Americans since the 1950s. The Fair Credit Reporting Act in 1970 was the first federal attempt to regulate this, because by then, private companies had decades of unregulated information on virtually every American adult. And then, in the 1980s, database marketing companies began merging purchase histories with demographic records to build predictive behavioral profiles on the population. And by 1990, companies had data on virtually every American household. And this was done before the internet, before smartphones. The government had been secretly aggregating data about people and selling predictions about their future behavior. So that phenomenon predates the web by 30 years. But the advent of the internet made all of this exponentially worse. Google, founded in 1998, initially had no sustainable business model. The breakthrough came when engineers realized that data exhaust, or the behavioral residue from using the service, could be used to build extraordinarily accurate predictive models of what users would do next. So, Google began harvesting this precious digital user data and selling it to advertisers. And by the time we get to 2000, two streams exist side by side. One state, one corporate. The state stream is legally constrained, imperfectly but still technically constrained. And the corporate stream is largely unregulated, but separate from government. So by the year 2000, we have these two separate rivers. But what happens next changes all of that forever.
I'll go kill him. Hey, can you look out your window right now?
Yeah.
Can you see a guy at about 4,000 feet, about 5 east of the airport right now? Looks like he's...
Yeah, I see him.
You see a guy, look, is he descending for the building also?
He's descending really quick, too, yeah.
Well, that's
2,500 feet now. He just dropped 800 feet in like one sweep.
That's another situation. What kind of airplane is that? Can you guys tell?
I don't know. I'll read it out in a minute. Another one just hit the building.
Wow. Another one hit it hard. Another one just hit the roof fade.
The whole building just came apart.
Holy smokes. All right, I guess you guys can be busy.
There was an end?
Hi, this is Huntress calling. I was told to give you a buzz for our mission crew commander. Any information? I guess 3 aircraft out of Boston are missing, and apparently 2 of them have hit the World Trade Center, and 1 is en route to Washington. Did you get that information?
9/11 provided the political permission to merge it with state power. and to do so in secret. On September 11, 2001, two things happened simultaneously after the attacks. First, the government's appetite for data, any data, about anyone, became politically unchallengeable. The U.S. Patriot Act in 2001 dramatically expanded government access to commercial records. You can listen to AOC mention this just last month.
And FISA, if this were to go dark, are you for the current FISA thing, or is this too broad right now? And what do you have concerns about a program going dark? Do you like the program?
Listen, FISA has been a constitutional and civil rights crisis since its drafting in the Patriot Act in post 9/11. We have a huge amount of problems with warrantless surveillance, wiretapping against American civilians.
So what exactly did the Patriot Act do in 2001? Section 215, the business records provision, allowed for the bulk collection of records held by third parties without traditional warrant requirements. The legal theory was that if you shared data with a corporation, you've surrendered your reasonable expectations of privacy. And this is called the third-party doctrine. And it's the same legal theory at the center of a current Supreme Court case being decided right now in 2026. And we'll speak more on this in a bit. The second thing that happened is subtler but equally important. The political culture shifted. Privacy advocates who raised concerns were told that they had nothing to fear if they had nothing to hide. Civil liberties organizations were characterized as obstructing national security, and the regulatory impulse that had produced FISA and the Fair Credit Reporting Act went to sleep. A generation of potential privacy legislation simply didn't happen. And the corporate surveillance stream, which had been quietly scaling through the 1990s through the internet boom, was now growing in a regulatory vacuum reinforced by national security culture. And you could listen to AOC talk about this also very recently when she's asked about the increasingly concerning state of AI being used to surveil American citizens in the name of safety.
What about the consequences? I mean, your home city was hit by 9/11,
Well,
and they say we need this to fend off.
This was the genesis of all of it, right? Of course, we want to make sure that we're prioritizing national security, but we also have to be a check on the use of that excuse of national security to invade and to violate the civil rights of everyday Americans who have a baked-in constitutional ability to conduct their lives with privacy and dignity.
Thank you.
And so to jump ahead a little bit to a decade later, Edward Snowden, NSA whistleblower, reveals in June of 2013 the completion of what the Patriot Act had authorized in principle. The National Security Agency's PRISM program had direct or near direct access to servers at Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook, Yahoo, YouTube, Skype, and AOL, among others. The infrastructure surveillance capitalists had built to extract behavioral surplus for advertisers had been quietly repurposed as the backdoor of the intelligence state. So this is enormous, right? Google built the pipes for advertising revenue, and then the NSA ran that data through the same pipes and participated in an unprecedented spying campaign on the American public. Meaning that the two data streams, one corporate and one state, had fused. The protections that FISA granted had been demolished, and crucially, it had been done in secret. The public had not consented, and most of Congress hadn't been fully briefed. The FISA court that nominally supervised it approved 1,800 applications out of 1,800 in one documented period. So you could imagine this was like a rubber stamp to just approve anything that came before the court. And so what Snowden revealed was important. It was monumental. It produced a lot of public shock and congressional hearings and the USA Freedom Act in 2015, but this only modestly curtailed some of this bulk collection. All of the infrastructure remained, the legal theory remained, The third-party doctrine remained, and the companies that had built this infrastructure, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, they were now worth trillions. So they were too big, too embedded in daily life, and too politically powerful to be meaningfully regulated or constrained. So we're getting closer to the modern day. Now we're in the period between 2018 and 2023. And the documented FBI abuses of Section 702 of FISA accumulate. The FISA court's own oversight reports reveal that the FBI conducted hundreds of thousands of warrantless searches of American citizens' communications, including searches of Black Lives Matter protesters, January 6 Capitol attendees, and congressional campaign donors. The court basically described this as widespread violations of the rules governing the searches. And once we arrive in 2024, Congress reauthorizes and expands Section 702 despite the documented abuse record, broadening the provider definition to potentially conscript any business handling communications infrastructure. And the abuses continue to accelerate into today. So this is a bit of the history that I wanted to provide you with to properly frame us in the current context of what's happening right now. But there's one component of this that I didn't include in the history, and it is impossible to understate. And this is the smartphone. The smartphone was the single greatest voluntary surveillance instrument ever distributed to a population at scale. And I remember this because I just started working at Apple that time, right ahead of the iPhone launch. The buzz for the iPhone was incredible. It was practically manic and deranged. I can remember how big of an inflection point that was. The hype was unlike anything that I had ever seen. People were lining up outside of the store and other stores all over the world, sleeping on sidewalks, clamoring to get their hands on an iPhone. And consumers gladly paid for it. And now we carry it everywhere. We sleep next to it. We stare into a glowing screen while we shit. It's exactly what Huxley had warned about in Brave New World. Not the shitting part. Not even Huxley had the imagination to predict that, but unlike Orwellian surveillance, Huxley's dystopia was maintained by satisfying every desire and preventing rebellion by making citizens love their servitude. Or, to quote Malcolm X,
oppression does not always come with chains. Sometimes it comes with comfort. When people become comfortable inside injustice, they stop demanding change, and that comfort becomes their cage.
So let's walk through the things that your phone collects. It collects location data, not just GPS, but cell tower triangulation, Wi-Fi positioning, Bluetooth proximity, behavioral data, which apps you open, in what order, for how long, and at what time of day. It collects communications metadata, who you contacted, when, for how long, and from where. It collects purchase data, health data, sleep data. It can infer emotional states from your typing speed and app usage patterns. It collects voice data when you use a voice assistant, and biometric data when you use Face ID or a fingerprint reader. So the phone doesn't just know where you are, it knows who you are. It knows what you want, what you're afraid of, and what you'll probably do next. But it doesn't stop at your phone or at your computer, because we live in an interconnected world of the Internet of Things. I've spoken about this in a previous podcast, but this means that there is an entire ecosystem of devices gathering data on you. Smart TVs that track what you watch and report it to advertisers, smart speakers that maintain an always-on audio capture, smart home devices like your thermostat that log when you leave and when you return, Amazon-owned Ring doorbells, now equipped with facial recognition that record everyone who approaches your home, and then share that footage with police and ICE. There's your car, which now generates and transmits detailed logs of your driving behavior, your location history, and in some cases, the content of your phone calls. And by 2027, next year, all new cars in the US will include cameras and infrared sensors to monitor your face while you drive. And they can even shut down the vehicle if you are deemed unfit to drive. So all of this to say, the physical world has become as instrumented as the digital one. There is no longer a meaningful distinction between online and offline life from a data collection standpoint. Everything about us is being profiled. Google is mining everything you search for in Google, everything you browse in Google Chrome, everywhere you go in Google Maps, everything you watch on YouTube. It's collecting communications information, harvesting the content of your emails, what you buy with Google Pay, and what you're asking Alexa. And while Google is collecting intimate personal information, Meta is building a social graph on you, looking at what content you're engaging with, what you're liking, what you're commenting on, what group chats you're in, even what memes you're sharing. They're collecting your private metadata from text messaging applications like WhatsApp and Messenger, and biometric data like facial recognition for tagging photos. And then there's Amazon. Amazon knows what you buy and knows how much you're shitting given how much toilet paper you're consuming. It has eyes at the front of your door through Ring. Apple stores health data on how much you move, and if you have an Apple Watch or the latest AirPods, it has data on what your heart health is and can even infer data about your sex life. And that's not a joke. I will get to that in the next segment. And recently, Meta announced it had developed an AI technology called Tribe. They trained it using actual MRI data of hundreds of people listening to podcasts and watching video content to begin to understand which content gets the most engagement. And they aim to use this as an accurate way to forecast engagement. So let's imagine a world where brands like Nike or Coca-Cola can test ad versions at incredible rapid speed and iterate without the need for focus groups. They can pay Facebook for the data on the user profiles and then create targeted ads based on your demographic and send you the one that lights up the brain scans the most, so that they can then maximize the chances that you'll engage with their content. So they're effectively building super ads based on your behavior and your brain physiology in order to get you to buy more stuff. And this is made easier by data brokers. These are the sort of invisible middlemen in this whole sequence of events. And most people know about Google and Meta and how they collect data. And so for some of you, that might be familiar. But fewer people know about the data broker industry. Companies like Oracle Data Cloud, Equifax's data marketing division, LexisNexis, and hundreds of other smaller players that each aggregate data from thousands of sources. They build comprehensive profiles on hundreds of millions of individuals and sell them to anyone willing to pay. And that's key there, because this includes the government. A 2023 Senate Intelligence Committee report found that U.S. intelligence agencies were purchasing location data, browsing histories, and personal profiles from commercial data brokers. So this means they were deliberately circumventing the warrant requirements that would apply if they had collected that same data themselves. And this is a dangerous precedent. It's consistent with a pattern of privatization that we see across time. Researchers call this data laundering. The Fourth Amendment says that the government needs a warrant to search your papers. But if a data broker has already collected those papers and is willing to sell it to them, then no warrant is required. The government is simply a customer. And you can listen to a recent congressional hearing where Senator Raskin questions the current head of FBI, Kash Patel, on this very thing.
Can you commit this morning to not buying Americans' location data?
Thank you. The FBI uses all tools, Senator, thank you for the question, to do our mission. We do purchase commercially available information that's consistent with the Constitution and the laws under the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, and it has led to some valuable intelligence for us to be utilized with our private and partner sectors.
So you're saying that the agency will buy Americans' location data. I believe that that's what you've said in kind of intelligence lingo, and I just want to say, as we start this debate, doing that without a warrant is an outrageous end run around the Fourth Amendment. It's particularly dangerous given the use of artificial intelligence to comb through massive amounts of private information. This is Exhibit A for why Congress needs to pass our bipartisan, bicameral bill, the Government Surveillance Reform Act. One last question. General Adams, for you, in 2021, your agency confirmed that it had purchased and searched domestic location data. It is still your agency's position that you can buy Americans' location data without a warrant? And if so, are you still doing it?
Senator, thanks for the question. With regards to commercially available information and publicly available information, the purchases that my agency makes is in alignment with the Constitution and protects U.S. persons' information.
But you're buying location data, correct? I mean, we've now had that referred to twice, and I don't think there's any question that you're doing it.
All of the purchasing of commercially available information by the agency is passed through legal channels and is in complete compliance with laws.
Thank you.
And since we're talking about surveillance capitalism, it makes sense to introduce the woman who coined the term. In 2018, a Harvard Business School professor named Shoshana Zuboff produced a 700-page book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It took her a decade to write it. And the argument at its core is something like this. Something genuinely new happened in human history. And it's not surveillance because that's ancient. And it's not capitalism because that's hundreds of years old. What's new is the merger into a single economic logic that treats human experience itself as a raw material to be extracted, processed, and sold. She calls that raw material behavioral surplus. The product being sold is predictions about your future behavior, and the customers are anyone who wants to modify that behavior, whether they be advertisers, political campaigns, insurance companies, law enforcement, or governments. And you can listen to her congressional testimony here.
And surveillance capitalism really doesn't care what you think. It doesn't care what you believe. It doesn't care how you act. What it does care about is that you think and believe and act in ways that it can capture the data. To do the aggregation that you're asking about, because with that aggregation is the possibility of computation, applying artificial intelligence, coming up with predictive algorithms, targeting methodologies. With those targeting methodologies, various functions are achieved, including increasing engagement, which is a euphemism for increasing the footprint for greater data extraction. And also, as we increase engagement, using our knowledge from this deep computation, AI, using our knowledge about you for things like subliminal cues, psychological micro-targeting, engineered social comparison dynamics. So we really, really know a lot about you, and that way we can use messaging and different, not only the content of messaging, but the forms of messaging to actually begin to modify your behavior, and to do that in a way that is consistent with the commercial objectives of the company and its business customers. So at the end of the day, this big other is sorry, I'll just wrap it up with the notion this big other is ubiquitous, is pervasive. It's not totalitarian, but it is full-on control and full-on opacity, full-on power.
So the infrastructure is built. The legal protections have been either gutted or rendered toothless, and the two streams, corporate extraction and state surveillance, have merged and become one. The smartphone has turned the population into a continuously broadcasting sensor network. And there are people who looked at all of this and saw not a crisis, but an investment opportunity. So let's talk about a billionaire named Peter Thiel. He and the companies he built, backed, and installed inside the halls of government are the subject of the next segment. What does it actually feel like to live inside a surveillance capitalist system? And who's running it? Surveillance capitalism doesn't happen by accident. It needs to be built with specific capital, with specific interests, making specific decisions. And this is where Peter Thiel comes in. Thiel effectively builds an interlocking surveillance infrastructure over the course of 25 years. He starts with PayPal's financial data, moves on to Palantir's analytics platform, funds Flock Safety's license plate network, Clearview AI's facial recognition databases, and Anduril's autonomous weapons and border surveillance towers. Each of these companies, which we'll take a look at in a moment, feed data or capability to the others, forming a vast and sprawling ecosystem of surveillance. And this is not a coincidence. It's a coherent vision of what the most valuable assets in an information economy look like. So in 1998, Peter Thiel co-founds PayPal, and he has access to financial behavior data at scale. Then in 2003, he co-founds Palantir Technologies, which was co-founded with CIA seed funding. It was explicitly built to merge commercial data with government intelligence. It is effectively a data integration, analytics, and AI software company which now holds $10 billion in U.S. Army contracts and is building a federal super database, combining data from every executive branch agency. It's the de facto operating system of American state power. You could think of Palantir as the umbrella system that organizes and leverages the data that all of the other partner companies collect. In 2004, Peter Thiel invests $500,000 in Facebook and owns 10% of the company, which would later become the largest behavioral data operation in human history. In 2005, he founds the Founders Fund, which is the vehicle through which Thiel is able to back all of these companies like Flock Safety or Anduril Industries' autonomous weapons, or Clearview AI or OpenAI or Anthropic. It's good to note, though, that this isn't a diversified tech fund. It's a concentrated bet on surveillance, defense, and AI infrastructure. And an important point in the story happens in 2011, when J.D. Vance enters the scene. At this point, J.D. Vance is a complete unknown. But Thiel sees something in him and makes him a partner at one of his venture capital firms. He then backs his VC fund and introduces him to Trump, and proceeds to donate $15 million to J.D. Vance's Senate campaign, making it the largest single Senate donation in American history. And now, his buddy is the Vice President of the United States. This was, I don't know how else to look at that other than a 14-year project to purchase a seat at the highest table in the American government. Effectively, Thiel built an interlocking surveillance ecosystem and then installed his protege at arm's length from the presidency. But let's talk a little bit more about Palantir. Palantir has embedded itself into more than 24 government organizations. We're talking the DoD, the USDA, the Air Force, the Army, the CDC, the FDA, the DOJ, the FBI, the CIA, NASA, and the IRS, to name a few. This is extensive. And on the topic of the IRS, I want to quote from an article published by The Intercept. The IRS use of the software, launched under Trump's first term and expanded under Biden, is now in the hands of an IRS Criminal Investigations Office that has drastically scaled back its pursuit of tax cheats and pivoted, under Trump's direction, toward investigating left-leaning groups, the Wall Street Journal reported in October. The real concern is the consolidation of vast amounts of sensitive personal data into a single system with minimal transparency, especially one built and operated by a contractor like Palantir, whose business model is premised on integrating data and expanding surveillance capabilities. Its platforms have been used in deeply troubling contexts, from immigration enforcement to predictive policing, with persistent concerns about overreach, bias, and weak oversight. And in March of this year, the Pentagon formally directed all military branches to adopt Palantir's Maven Smart system as their standard AI platform. The U.S. Army consolidated 75 previously separate software contracts into a single $10 billion Palantir relationship. ICE uses Palantir's Immigration OS to track undocumented immigrants in real time. And the Trump administration is using Palantir to build a super database combining data from every federal agency. So the company that Peter Thiel co-founded with CIA seed funding in 2003 is now functionally the operating system of the American state. And let's talk a little bit more about Flock Safety and Clearview AI. Because Flock is not just traffic cameras. There are nearly 90,000 AI-powered license plate readers deployed across more than 5,000 communities, scanning 20 billion plates every month. And the cameras build what Flock calls a vehicle fingerprint. It's a profile that includes not just your license plate, but your car's make and model and color, whether it has a roof rack or body damage or bumper stickers. It's painting a unique fingerprint to identify your vehicle, even without needing the license plate. And this data is stored for over 30 days and is searchable by any of the 6,000 law enforcement agencies in Flock's network. There is no opt-out for citizens, so every car that drives past the camera is logged. The police have described the goal as creating a curtain of technology that makes it difficult to drive anywhere of any distance without running into a camera somewhere. And the more insidious thing is that these cameras don't just capture visual information. They also capture audio. The audio capture is called a Raven. And so when the system identifies a qualifying sound, it analyzes the audio signature and sends law enforcement an approximate location, allowing officers to respond almost instantly, including all situations where no 911 call has been made. And this has been controversial because these cameras were originally marketed purely for gunshot detection. But Raven has since expanded its capabilities. And currently, Flock is rolling out a new feature allowing these microphones to begin listening for human voices in distress. And it's, again, unsurprisingly, being marketed in the name of safety. Their slogan is, "Safety you can see and now hear." So civil liberties groups like the EFF and the ACLU have raised the alarms about this expansion, arguing that introducing a feature that allows microphones that are already installed all over cities to begin listening for human voices is likely to open up a whole new set of unforeseen legal, civil liberties, and safety consequences. I've been following researchers like Ben Jordan who have demonstrated that these cameras are sometimes streaming to the open internet, and that they are hackable. They have already recorded numerous abuses of police officers looking through the contents of these cameras to follow exes or surveil their wives or for any other unsavory things you could think of. But we're not just talking about flock cameras. Thiel has invested in other technologies that can be funneled through Palantir. One of those is Clearview AI. And to understand Clearview AI, you have to imagine if someone had spent years downloading every photograph ever posted publicly to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, news websites, court records, mugshots, anywhere on the open internet where a human face appeared. And then imagine that they ran all of those photographs through software that mapped the precise geometry of every face. The distance between your eyes, the shape of your nose, the angle of your jaw, the size of your ears, and converted each face into a unique fingerprint or a face print. And now imagine that they stored all of those face prints in a searchable database. So you take a photo of a stranger on the street, you upload it, and within seconds you get back every photo of that person that exists anywhere on the public internet. Their Facebook profile, their LinkedIn page, news articles about them, a photo someone tagged them in at a party, along with links to where each image was found. So this is what Clearview AI does. And the company has scraped over 50 billion images across the web. And according to their own FAQ, the database now contains over 70 billion images. Clearview's founder pitched this software to the Border Patrol on a proposal that included screening arrivals for sentiment about the USA, specifically proposing to scan migrants' social media for posts saying, "I hate Trump," or "Trump is a puta," and targeting, and this is real, and targeting anyone with an affinity for far-left groups. He had explicitly proposed to use facial recognition not just for identity verification, but for political filtering at the border. This is a highly controversial software, and it has been banned in Canada. The ACLU has sued Clearview in Illinois under the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, which requires companies to obtain written consent before collecting biometric identifiers like face prints. The 2022 settlement permanently banned Clearview nationwide from making its database available to private businesses and individuals, meaning that now it can only be sold to law enforcement and government agencies. State-level restrictions currently apply in Vermont, New Jersey, Illinois, Maine, Massachusetts, and Montana. Internationally, the rejection has been more aggressive. As I mentioned, Canada's privacy commissioner condemned Clearview as mass surveillance and said it was completely unacceptable for millions of people who will never be implicated in any crime to find themselves continually in a police lineup. The UK fined Clearview $7.5 million and ordered the immediate deletion of all UK residents' data. Australia, France, and Italy have issued similar fines and deletion orders. And so it's pretty clear that America has a different approach to surveillance. And the system has already put at least 14 innocent people in jail. And there are racial concerns about this because it is known that this software is less accurate against people of color, and it is deployed disproportionately against people of color. So there are obvious civil liberties violations in plain sight. And so just to pause here for a moment and step back, we're describing a situation in the United States where Americans are now able to be surveilled. Unprecedented amounts of data are being collected on individuals. They're being sold by data brokers, and your movements are being tracked and cataloged in the streets. Your cars are tracking you. Your Ring doorbell is helping a direct from door to deportation pipeline. And the Fourth Amendment was designed specifically to prevent general warrants. This was the British era instrument that authorized agents to search anyone, anywhere, for any reason, without even naming a specific suspect or a specific crime. And the founders considered this to be the most dangerous instrument of tyranny. So let that sink in for a moment, because I think that is a really unsettling thing to sit with. Because what Flock has built is a permanent, passive, nationwide general warrant. It doesn't wait for probable cause. It just records first and makes that record available for search retroactively for any person that an authorized user decides to type into a field. And I began this episode with one of the documented abuses, with the abortion search. But then there's the ICE backdoor, where local cops search Flock data on behalf of ICE. They might type something in like ICE fugitive or illegal immigration as the search reason. And they do that in states where doing so violated state law. At least 8 Washington state agencies have given Border Patrol direct access to their Flock networks. San Francisco police, in a sanctuary city, a state where the law explicitly prohibits this, allowed out-of-state agencies to make almost 2 million searches of their Flock databases. And then there's the Ring partnership. In October of 2025, Amazon Ring announced a partnership with Flock. So Ring's doorbells now have facial recognition, and Flock's cameras log your license plate. And together, your neighbor's doorbell can identify your face, your car's movements can be tracked by the 90,000 cameras on the street, and that data can reach ICE, all without a warrant, all without your knowledge, and all without anyone having suspected you of any crime. This isn't a paranoid delusion or conspiracy. This is the state of affairs on the streets today in 2026 in America. And just recently, weeks ago, a very relevant Supreme Court case is happening in Chatry versus the United States. The Supreme Court heard arguments for what I would say is one of the most important digital privacy cases in decades. And the question was about, does a geofence warrant, which ordered Google to hand over location data on every phone in a defined area, violate the Fourth Amendment? And the court currently seems divided. Listen to attorney Adam Unikowski try to explain the point to the court.
If you don't want the government to have your location history, you just flip that off. You don't have to have that feature on your phone. So what's the issue?
I take the point that you can flip it off, but I guess I just don't agree that one should have to flip off one's location history as well as other cloud services to avoid government surveillance. I mean, by the same token, you don't have to send email. You can flick that off as well, but that doesn't imply that you're implicitly consenting to the government searching one's email.
Well, not implicitly consenting, but the only reason the government has access to this information is because you've decided to make it public to the extent it can be accessed by people any number of ways. In other words, people can use that information, not simply law enforcement.
Well, I guess
it's like if you don't want them to peer into your window, you can close your window or the shades.
I take the point, Your Honor, but I guess I'd respectfully disagree with that assessment for a couple of reasons. So first of all, I think you could say the same thing about sending mail. If you don't want the government to look in your mail, you don't have to send it and give it to the Postal Service, or the same thing with a safety deposit box. But I think that one should be permitted to hand over data to a third party without assuming the government is going to look at it, especially since it's true in this case petitioner was convicted of the crime, but geofence warrants mostly ensnare innocent people. In this case, you had 19 people within the geofence whose data was exposed, as well as 2 other devices whose actual identity was exposed. And Google received 9,000 of these warrants in 2019. So I don't think an innocent person should have to shut off these services as a condition of not being surveilled.
Do the numbers make a difference? Would it matter if only 1%?
So the context here is that the police had requested that Google give them all of the information on all of the people who were at a bank at a specific time window when a robbery took place. So they got a warrant, they gave it to Google, and they accessed the data of 19 people who were within that geofence. The problem was that the geofence, because there is a margin of error for where the fence is drawn, it extended into a nearby church, roping in a bunch of people that weren't even in the bank. So a secondary search needed to happen. And then of those 19, 9 were identified to be in the bank. And then another search was made where those 9 people were narrowed down to 3. And from those 3, they managed to identify who the bank robber was. So the Supreme Court is trying to understand whether or not this violates the Fourth Amendment. And Justice Sotomayor asks a question which I think helps to clarify the importance of what is being ruled upon. So listen to that here.
Counsel, I just want to button down some of your answers. The privacy policy that the person is giving consent to would affect, you said internet, but it would also affect Google Photos, which have to do with what photos you take and store in your device, correct?
Correct.
Google Documents, what documents you store.
Correct.
Google Calendar, your entire calendar. If this is consent, that means the government can seek those documents for any reason, not just the commission of a crime, or no reason, correct?
Correct. It would not be a search, so no search warrant would be required.
So that means the government, a police officer, randomly, who decides, I don't like that person, let me just go look at their life to see if I can find the crime, that would be okay.
There might be some constraints under the Stored Communications Act, but as far as the Fourth Amendment is concerned,
but
no.
That's not at issue here.
But overall, after listening to more than 2 hours of this hearing, my impression is that the Supreme Court is just not technologically literate enough to make an adequate ruling here. And at the risk of sounding ageist, no one is under the age of 54. 6 of the 9 justices are over the age of 60. So the likely outcome is a narrow ruling rather than a categorical statement. But the legal principle at play is identical to the one underlying Flock, which is the third-party doctrine that I mentioned earlier in this episode, which says that if you voluntarily shared your location with Google by enabling location history, the government doesn't need a warrant. The founders who wrote the Fourth Amendment precisely to prevent these general warrants would almost certainly disagree. But there's another problem with any hope of regulation. Trump appointed a presidential council of advisors on science and technology. And 12 of the 13 initial members were active tech CEOs. You have Zuckerberg and Ellison, Sergey Brin and Jensen Huang, to name a few. And each of them had donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration. And each one runs a company subject to federal regulation. But each is now advising the president on science and technology policy. So the regulated have become the regulators. And this is a insanely dangerous precedent that I cannot understate enough. Shoshana Zuboff, in her work, names this pattern an epistemic coup. It's the moment when the question of who decides, who knows, is answered by the companies that profit from that knowledge extraction. And so we are in a very precarious position. And so we've kind of spoken about this in the abstract, but I want to talk about what this means for you. We've covered what data is being collected, how the legal protections are not in place. We've talked about some abuses. We've talked about controversial companies. We've talked about how Peter Thiel is consolidating power to surveil at an even greater degree. But what does this mean? And I want to talk about a few different aspects of this, because this kind of surveillance capitalism impacts you not just structurally, but legally and economically. So let's talk about that for a minute. There's this concept of the behavioral futures market. And these aren't just abstract financial instruments. They are the engine behind every personalized price, every targeted ad, every recommendation algorithm. And it works like this. When a retailer knows that you're in the parking lot, they can charge you more. And Target was caught doing exactly this and paid $5 million in civil penalties. When an airline detects that you've searched for the same route multiple times, when Uber knows that your phone battery is dying, the price goes up. And an Uber scientist confirmed in 2016 that the company knew users in that state were more willing to pay surge prices. The question isn't whether this data was used, it's whether you were ever told it was being collected at all. And this isn't something that affects you when you're booking flights or making travel plans or ordering things on Instacart or traveling to Target. It's rolling out to all Walmart stores by the end of 2026, by the end of this year. And Walmart claims that these kind of AI-generated surveillance prices are just operational efficiency tools. But Walmart also holds patents for systems that use AI and customer purchase history to dynamically adjust the prices based on demand, time of day, and individual customer profiles. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a literal patent filing. So the infrastructure for surge pricing at the grocery store is being built right now as you listen to this and is being quietly rolled out all across America. And once Walmart does it, you can expect that every major retailer will follow suit. So, welcome to behavioral futures markets. In January 2025, the FTC released findings from a formal surveillance pricing investigation. Companies were routinely using location data, demographic information, browsing history, and even mouse movement patterns to set individualized prices. In one case, Instacart grocery prices differed by as much as 23% between customers buying identical items. That's not personalization. That is maximum extraction. And then there's the biometric layer. This is where the commercial and state streams converge on your body. Facial recognition at hotel check-in, or in drugstores for loss prevention, in dating apps, or identity verification systems to use certain applications on your phone. Meta's Ray-Ban smart glasses, there were internal company documents that showed that Meta was planning a real-time facial recognition feature called Name Tag, and calculated that political turbulence in 2025 would create an appealing time window to release it without public scrutiny. And you can listen to AOC get questioned about this here.
Are you concerned about ICE agents wearing these meta glasses? Like, are they going to start profiling?
Absolutely, absolutely. And they have made clear that their goal is not even immigrants so much as it is profiling every American who comes out to protest, profile every American who exercises their First Amendment rights. They want to create a mass surveillance state. They want to know every one of your movements, and they want to hand all of that over, not just in a government database, but also to these AI companies as well. And we cannot allow for that to happen. Absolutely not.
Federal agents in Minneapolis are photographing people's faces at traffic stops. ICE is holding a $9.2 million contract with Clearview AI in Illinois, a state that has banned local police from using it. And importantly, there's a legal layer here. So remember earlier when I mentioned that these apps are collecting data that can shed light on your sex life? Well, a Connecticut woman had her Fitbit data subpoenaed during divorce proceedings. Her husband's legal team used that data to challenge her account of her whereabouts and activity levels on specific dates. So they knew when she wasn't home and her heart rate was getting a little high late at night, if you know what I mean. So fitness tracker data has since become a standard target for discovery in contested divorce cases, particularly when physical activity, location, or daily routine is relevant to claims about lifestyle or infidelity. And then we have another significant case here. This is with Flow Health. They are a period tracking app with over 100 million users who in 2021 were caught sharing menstrual cycle data, including when users marked themselves as pregnant or trying to conceive, with Facebook and Google for ad targeting purposes, despite explicitly promising users that their health data would remain private. So the FTC settled with Flow in 2021, but the settlement had no financial penalty. And after Dobbs overturned Roe versus Wade in 2022, the case took on a completely different dimension. Because that same data that was being sold to advertisers could now be subpoenaed by states pursuing abortion prosecutions. And so what did Flow do? What would any reasonable surveillance capitalist do in a situation like this? They would see an opportunity. And that's what they did. So Flow responded by introducing an anonymous mode. And you guessed it. You could be anonymous and have your reproductive data private for $4.99 a month. And so it's wild. It's super dystopian. It's incredible. It's unbelievable. But this is all real. And because of Dobbs overturning Roe versus Wade, the landscape has produced real cases rather than abstract hypothetical ones. In Nebraska in 2023, Meta handed over Facebook Messages data to prosecutors. These were messages in which a mother discussed helping her teenage daughter obtain abortion pills. And the messages were obtained via a standard warrant served to Meta, which Meta complied with. The mother and daughter were both charged. The mother sentenced to 2 years in prison. I think the daughter was sentenced to 90 days. But this wasn't a data breach. This was a legal data sharing pipeline operating exactly as designed. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this structural layer to all of this where there is a problem with racialized accuracy. There are documented error rates for darker skinned people, and the people who are being face scanned by ICE agents in Minneapolis are overwhelmingly not white. And that's not incidental, that's structural. A technology that fails disproportionately on certain populations is being deployed disproportionately against those same populations. This is a civil rights crisis as much as it is a privacy story. And the consent architecture is worth naming explicitly because every one of these systems, the hotel check-in biometrics, Apple ID verifications, flock cameras on public streets, Walmart pricing algorithms, it's all built on either coerced consent, where you agree or you can't use the service at all, or no consent at all, where you're just being publicly surveilled on the streets as you go about your business. And Shoshana Zuboff calls this the behavioral surplus. This is surveillance firms claiming the right to take possession of a resource that they had no part in creating, and that you are not compensated for, that they profit off of and sell for obscure purposes. And maybe the final thing worth noting here is that there is a feedback loop between corporate surveillance infrastructure and state power. Flock Safety's license plates feed Palantir's Gotham. Palantir's Immigration OS tracks migrants in real time. ICE uses Clearview AI's scraped facial database. And all of it is built on private capital, sold back to the state. And the state uses it to enforce and enhance power, while the same executives who built it literally advise the president on science and technology policy. And so what I've just described is not a series of separate problems. It's not tech companies behaving badly, or government overreach, or pricing algorithms as separate issues to be addressed by separate regulators and separate hearings. It's one system. Shoshana Zuboff calls it the big other. Not Big Brother, because Big Brother at least had to tell you it was watching you. But Big Other doesn't need to. It operates through infrastructure so embedded in daily life that participation is practically mandatory. You can't easily opt out of driving on public roads. You can't opt out of your phone's location data without losing core functionality of the phone. You can't opt out of the data broker's industry's files on you. because those files were built from public records, purchase histories, and data you gave to companies that sold it, all without your meaningful consent. And you can't vote out this system because the people running the system are now inside the institution that regulates it. It's been captured. And so the question, the one that I've been avoiding so far, because it's an uncomfortable one, is what can we actually do? And that's what we'll talk about here in the final segment. So what we're asking here is resistance possible when the coup has already happened? And there are certain things that I want to talk about first here, because I don't want to offer a false sense of hope. To me, things look pretty grim. It's pretty dire. And we know that certain things which have worked in the past won't now. So individual privacy hygiene, where you set up VPNs or ad blockers or delete apps or opt out of cookies. These things aren't meaningless, but they're not really political acts. The system is designed to absorb this kind of response because it doesn't need all of your data. So even if half the people opted out, they would still have meaningful data on half the population. And Zuboff's point is precise here. She says when social participation itself, accessing healthcare, paying taxes, communicating with employers and family, requires passing through surveillance capitalism supply chains, individual opt-out is not available as a meaningful strategy. And so we know that this won't work. Voting has been completely insufficient at stopping this. And again, that goes back to the regulatory capture that happened before most voters knew what surveillance capitalism even was. And I don't mean the most recent appointment by the president. I mean back in 2001, from that period between 2001 and 2011. This is when the infrastructure was being built. This is when the legal infrastructure was gutted. And this is when companies scaled to the point of being politically invulnerable. So by the time that Snowden's revelations made all of this legible to the public in 2013, Google was already worth $300 billion. Facebook had 1 billion users, and both companies had armies of lobbyists who had spent a decade writing the regulatory language that governed them. So the window for democratic intervention has mostly passed. And looking to the courts to rule on this, I mean, going back to the Chatri decision, it's expected by summer of 2026. Maybe it produces some meaningful constraints on geofence warrants and addresses the third-party doctrine, but it doesn't look like that's likely to save us. The Supreme Court justices don't adequately understand the technology they are tasked with ruling on. And the Fourth Amendment is a 230-year-old document designed for a world of physical papers and physical spaces. It is being asked to govern a world of behavioral surplus, predictive algorithms, and AI-powered location tracking. So the courts aren't failing. The Fourth Amendment isn't failing. They're just being asked to deal with something that they weren't designed to deal with, and at a speed that they can't keep up with. So that leaves us with the question, okay, if we can't protest our way out of this, if we can't modify our behavior, if we can't vote our way out of it, if the courts aren't likely to save us, then what can we do? This is a good question, and I don't have a clear answer for this. One thing that I would say is that we could look towards the EU as a proof of concept. You know, they passed the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. They did that in 2018. And of course, it's imperfect. It's unevenly enforced and frequently circumvented. But it has also produced billions in fines against Google, Meta, and Amazon. And it's forced changes to the data collection practices. So I mean, Europe passed this law and America didn't. So that signals that it's a political choice, not an inevitability. Things can happen to curtail this and change this if there is enough momentum behind it. It also seems like state level action is the near-term battleground. If you look at the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, also known as BIPA, this is the most powerful privacy law in the United States at the moment. It requires companies to obtain informed written consent before collecting biometric data, and it provides a private right of action, meaning that individuals can sue. So far, it's produced a $650 million settlement from Facebook, a $100 million settlement from Google, and is currently the basis of multiple ongoing suits against other biometric data collectors. So you have other states that are passing laws on how flock data can be shared in Illinois, Washington, and California, and there is some traction there. But again, these laws are imperfect and they vary wildly, but they do demonstrate that there is some legislative intervention that can change corporate behavior. We spoke about the Supreme Court decision as a possible inflection point. Yeah, whatever they decide about the geofence warrants, the decision will have downstream impacts on Flock, on data broker access to location data, on the third-party doctrine that has effectively been the legal foundation of warrantless government access to commercial data for 4 decades. So a ruling that genuine probable cause is required before accessing aggregate location data would be significant. So we can stay tuned for that, but I don't know if I would count on that. I would say probably the most radical thing that we can do right now is what you're doing right now. Shoshana Zuboff wrote that the first principle of resistance is naming. So before you can build a political coalition against something, you have to be able to describe it. And the terminology matters. Surveillance capitalism, behavioral surplus, the big other, the epistemic coup, the third-party doctrine, all of these things aren't just jargon. They're the vocabulary of a political fight that hasn't yet been fully joined because most people don't have the words for what's happening to them. And this is where we can turn to journalism, books, podcasts, conversations to help us construct a shared understanding of this system. And this isn't a substitute for political action, of course, but it is a prerequisite. It is a necessary first step here. Because the stakes are high. These structures are aiming to modify our behavior. Back in 2012, Facebook ran a voter turnout experiment. It was a simple A/B test where they added an I voted button and a social proof about neighbors voting. And this simple thing demonstrably increased voter turnout. They ran this experiment without the knowledge or consent of the users involved. And it wasn't illegal. It was, like I said, a standard A/B test. But what it demonstrated is that a company with access to the behavioral layers of 3 billion people can, quietly and invisibly, influence the outcome of democratic elections. And they did this without propaganda. They just did it by creating a simple nudging behavior. So the behavioral futures market isn't just about selling you things. It's about shaping what you do, what you believe, and even who you vote for. I want to touch briefly on Zuboff's deepest claim here, which is that democracy does not simply require that people can vote. That isn't democracy, right? It requires that people can think, that people can form opinions, weigh evidence, reach conclusions, without that process being continuously observed, modeled, and modified by entities with a financial interest in the outcome. Because when the information environment is controlled by platforms whose business models require maximizing engagement, which means maximizing outrage, fear, and tribalism, the epistemic conditions of democratic governance are being systematically eroded and degraded. not in the name of censorship, but in the name of optimization. And the merger is complete. Everything documented in this episode, the Peter Thiel network, Palantir inside the Pentagon, flock cameras feeding ICE, Clearview AI identifying faces at traffic stops, Zuckerberg on the Presidential Science Advisory Board, is the operational reality of a world in which the surveillance capitalist infrastructure and the state have become a single institutional order. This is what Zuboff was talking about when she described the epistemic coup. It isn't an overthrow of the state, as you might expect with a traditional coup, but it's an overthrow of the people's sovereignty. And the question of who knows, who decides who knows, and who decides who knows is now answered by the companies that profit from the answer. And we didn't elect them, and we cannot easily unelect them. And I want to come back to where we started this episode, with the woman in Texas, with her abortion, the detective searching a database compiled by 83,000 cameras. And I think we should be precise about what happened there, because it's easy to reach for a surface conclusion. The surface conclusion is that the system worked as it was intended to work. A surveillance tool was built for crime prevention. It was misused for reproductive surveillance, and Flock's policies prohibit this kind of use, so it's an aberration and the detective should be fined. But the system is working as it should. I think that is the surface read. The deeper read is that the system worked exactly as it was designed to work. A nationwide network of surveillance cameras with no opt-out, connected to 6,000 law enforcement agencies across the country, searchable without a warrant. For any reason a user types into a field, will be used for every reason a user wants to type into a field. The prohibition in the policy is not a technical constraint. It's just the terms of service. And terms of service do not stop people with badges from looking through databases and doing what they want to do. And we have to note that these technologies, at scale, they create a permanent, passive, nationwide general warrant, which is a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights, which was designed to protect you against this very thing. This all-seeing eye doesn't search you when you're suspected of something. It records you wherever you are and makes that record available for search retroactively for any reason a user decides to type into a field. This is a paradigm shift in the way law enforcement obtains data, which could be used against you in a court of law. It also unleashes powerful predictive policing mechanisms in which your data may make you the suspect of a crime or a coordinated government crackdown. And so at the end here, I just want to say that I think the coup has, in important respects, already succeeded. The infrastructure has been built. The legal protections have been gutted. And the people who built the systems are now advising the president. The army is running on Palantir. The police is running on Flock. Faces at your door are logged by Ring and shared with ICE. But the takeaway here, and I think this is the most important thing that you walk away with, is that the moment that you understand the architecture, really understand it, and its specifics, with its names and its numbers and its key players, you are no longer simply inside of it. You are no longer simply being watched. You are looking at it. And that's not nothing. It's not enough, but it is where everything else begins. The show notes, sources, and a full transcript can be found in the show notes or at thepassingthroughpodcast.com. If this episode was useful to you, share it with someone who you think should hear it. The most subversive thing you can do right now is help other people understand what's going on. Thank you for listening. Be good to one another, and I will talk to you next time. Thank you for passing through today. Yeah, you, dear listener. Thank you for your support, for your attention, for spending some time with me and this episode's guest. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe, rate it, like it, tell your friends about it, buy a billboard somewhere next to a highway promoting it. I mean, I'm kidding, of course, but your support really does mean a lot to me. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next time.
Well, the first thing is, you notice so much of our discussion has been, we minimize data, or, how is the data used and things like that. Once we start a discussion talking about data, we've already lost primary ground. The key thing is now that we are all targets for massive scale secret data collection, much of which should not be collected in the first place. The decision rights should lie with the individual. Do I want to share this information about the cancer that runs in my family? And do I want to share that with a research operation or a federation of researchers that are going to make progress on this disease and help the world? Maybe so. But do I want Google or Facebook or any other company to just be inferring information about my cancer from my searching and my browsing? Absolutely not. So we need to reestablish decision rights, as Justice Douglas offered in 1967, the idea that every individual should have the freedom to select what about their experience is shared and what remains private. These decision rights are the cause of which privacy is the effect. We need to establish now, finally, in law, juridical rights that give us the choice of what is shared and what remains private. Then we've got a whole new ballgame.